Hello, my name is Brian Wargo, and I am the chair of the Data Committee for the Hawk Migration Association of North America. We are tasked with giving a longevity survey, and that's what we did in February of 2022. And the Data Committee consists of myself, Lori Goodrich, Vic Labaugh, Julie Brown, Robert Spall, and Jason Sodergren. The survey that we developed was put onto a Google form survey so that we could send that out, and it was sent to 202 Hawk sites. About half responded. I received several additional emails with additional comments, and technology was a problem for just a few of our older Hawk watchers who might not have felt as comfortable with technology. Like any survey, when you give one, you realize in hindsight, maybe your questions weren't targeting exactly what you were trying to ask. It's hard to know that in advance, so our questions can always be more precise. And if we give another survey, a follow-up survey, we'll try to target those a little bit better. We had to decide how many questions that we wanted to put in this survey. It turned out that every committee, when they found out that we were giving a survey, wanted a few in there, so we ended up getting too many questions. But then we cut too many out, and we had to put some back in. So while the survey seemed to be a little long, in some respects, we almost needed to add a few more questions back in. But again, that's going to happen anytime you have a survey. And some of the questions were improperly either prompted or the responses were incorrect. And that was mainly my fault. So I apologize for that. But the real question is, once we get the results and we download them, how do we display them? So a summary of the results. I'll just get to some of the high points or low points, whatever you want to consider. But Hawk watchers absolutely vary greatly in their problems and issues. A couple of interesting ones are obtaining issues, insecticide spraying, deteriorating roads, snow events, power struggles, changing ownership of either land or Hawkwatch, managers of the land, viewability, etc. The reason I wanted to give this list is to show that the problems are multifaceted and diverse. And so all Hawkwatches are not the same, and they have particular struggles. So as we go through and try to make generalizations, understand these are just a few of the issues that are very important to any or to a particular Hawkwatch, but not to all of them. So there are some commonalities. Staffing, of course, is going to be one. The lack of replacements. Who's going to be there when our older Hawkwatchers retire? And there's a general sense that this next generation, we're not seeing them at most Hawkwatches. There are a few that are very lucky that seem to have a robust small army following in their footsteps, but most, it is not that same sentiment. Visibility. Trees are becoming a problem in maintaining the Hawkwatches that we're collecting data. If you have trees that are growing up over the years, that can inhibit your view, and that might change the count. This is something that concerns several of our Hawkwatchers. Accessibility. Again, landowners. Many of these Hawk sites are either on private land or they might be public land, but regardless, you're going to have to deal with either park managers who might be in charge of when the road is open, when it's closed. You might have to ask for a permit each year. These are issues that some sites deal with and others do not. But I think this was a common theme throughout, that accessibility to county hawks because of the physical landscape or logistics. And support. Support is going to come in many different forms, such as helpers, spotters, people that financially support the land or the society that might be running the organization. And of course we had COVID-19, which hopefully we're coming out of this. I'm filming this, recording this in March of 2022, and it seems as though we might be getting a handle on COVID, I hope. But of course, COVID did influence some of the Hawk sites, and we'll talk about that. Once I downloaded the data, you have to clean it. And what I mean by that is I'm going to take the form data and I'm going to put it into an Excel form. And Excel is going to be peculiar, so I can't just run statistics on this without cleaning it first. And I'll just give you a little bit of a background on the formatting. For instance, a lot of people put words in instead of a number like 12, they spelled out 12. Excel doesn't know what to do with that. Or units such as years. And then some people had given 2 surveys, but their comments were really interesting because it's like they had something else to say, so I did incorporate those. Most of their numerical values were the same, so I might have just averaged the 2, or you might have had 2 independent people from a particular Hawk site that both filled out the survey, so making all those decisions. And then another problem is a 0 is not the same as a blank in Excel, so did they mean to leave it blank, or did they put a 0 as a placeholder? Just cleaning up all of those issues. And so on the right hand side you can see a few of these issues that I've pointed in blue, but I don't think most need to know every detail about this. So let's move on. First question, is your Hawkwatch data up to date? 89% said yes, so that's really a strong response that most Hawkwatches are up to date. So with the no, we'll get into a little bit more of that later on. Let's move to the next question. What season does your site report data to Hawkcountorg? And I think most of us know that fall is going to have a greater number of sites than the spring, but there are a few that do both. For instance, if we look at the orangish part of the pie chart, about 17% of our Hawk sites are going to report spring and fall data, but the vast majority, 60%, is fall only. We also wanted to know, what is the first year your Hawkwatch reported data to Hawkcount.org? This question could have been written a little bit better because some people clearly had data that originated before Hawkcount.org. If they've uploaded it, would have been a better question. So this one's a little ambiguous, hard to know exactly how to take all of this, but again, that was probably poor questioning. But you could see Hawkcount.org comes online around 99, 2000, and we're going to have a massive spike here. However, there are sites that are going to enter data, the historic data they had before that, into Hawkcount.org. And it could also be that they have submitted green sheets, and they're assuming that is going to be the same thing. So again, the question might have been flawed. But in general, you can see the vast majority of people, or Hawk sites, started when Hawkcount.org had started. What was the last year your Hawkwatch reported to Hawkcount.org? And we can see it's in the last 2 or 3. There are a few that are no longer active but are still listed on our sites, and so we did contact them also. Do you still consider your Hawk site active? The reason we ask this question is we have some sites that have gone offline. We're not sure if that was because of COVID-19. We have some that went offline before COVID-19. We're not sure if they're planning on coming back. And most of the respondents, at least, remember, we sent it out to 202 Hawk sites, got about 98 responses back. 97 Hawk sites responded on this particular question, and 96% still consider their site active. Because often we'll have a Hawk site that is closed down, but they don't formally say anything, so we're not sure if we should, no longer consider that, or at least be waiting for new data. How many seasons has your site been reporting to Hawkcount.org? This is an anonymous survey, at least for the viewers of this, but if you look at the very end, my picture is in the way here. I don't know if I can move it. It does not look like I can, but there's a site here that goes to 85 years, and I think most of us can probably figure out what that site is. But regardless, we can see that we have lots of sites that have data 21 years ago, 15 to 20 years ago, about 20 sites. So, and that makes sense. How many hours does your site typically count in the fall season? 77 sites responded. This is an interesting one here. These are a couple notes that I put for myself. We had two people from the Allegheny Front. I was one of them, so I wanted to point that I actually used some of my own data here. And just a few notes on here, but how many hours in a fall season? And you can see as we sweep out to the right side, we have more hours in the fall than we would in the spring. And some sites count over 1,000 hours per season, per fall season, which is rather impressive. There's a lot of sites that count much fewer, so 0 to 50 hours. About 10% of our, 12% of our responders said that somewhere between 0 and 50. And then we have, some kind of distribution. And again, I need to pick the bin sizes when I make these graphs. And depending on how you pick the bins, you can make the bars either smoother or chunked out more. So, but as you would expect, as you increase, then look at the sites with increased hours, there's going to be fewer of them. But we do have some pretty impressive numbers here. How many days does your site typically count in a fall season? And as you would expect, some are going to count much further into the season and others are not. This is also an odd question because a lot of respondents weren't really sure how to answer this. Do I count like an 8-hour day, or if I was out there for an hour in one day, does that count, and so on. It's inevitable to end up with these kind of questions after you make the survey. And by the way, we did pilot this with a few of our board members, but again, you always get better every iteration of making a survey. And by the way, feel free to pause this video at any point in time if you'd like to take more time with any of these inscriptions. How many hours does your site typically count in the spring season? The hours are going to be less. My picture is probably in the way. I don't know how to get rid of that right now. But the idea is that in the spring season, we're not going up to 1,000 hours. Behind me here is we top out at 600 hours. So we have a few sites that do that, but most of our sites are counting fewer hours than in the fall. And here we only had 37 sites that responded. So if I counted all these up, it would be 37 total sites. How many days does your site typically count in a spring season? And we can see the median is, or I should say, the mode, the number of sites that count the most particular days in a spring is, somewhere from 50 to 70. We have 6 sites of each of those, and some count a little bit longer and some count less. There was a lot of COVID questions, and we've given a COVID survey before, so I figured I would just put all of these on the one slide and just tackle this all at once. If you're not interested in this, you can always skip to the next slide. How did COVID-19 affect your 2020 and 2021 seasons? And we asked them to choose those that applied. We had 42% of our responders say there were fewer observers or counters due to the pandemic. And your first thought might be that, okay, COVID-19 really had a great effect, but when we look at our data later on, we'll find that most didn't feel that COVID-19 had that big of an effect. But it did. They are saying they did have fewer observers or counters. Observation hours were reduced because of the pandemic. 25% said, yeah, that's something that we had to do. We were not able to offer any Raptor education. 17% said that's a true statement. But that doesn't mean all sites were able to offer Raptor education beforehand. So again, the questions could always be asked a little different. Raptor education efforts were still possible but limited. 24% responded. COVID-19 did not affect our count season in any way. 28.6% agreed with that. And we also had this section where we could put any other comments that you would like to put. And I looked at each one of those, and that really does take a lot of time. But we'll go on with that. So we then asked directly, do you feel that your data was compromised due to COVID-19 during the 2020-2021 spring or fall seasons? And so when we have 80% say no, 20% said yes, it did compromise it. So the real question is, do we flag that data? Do we end up needing to put an asterisk next to your data? That's what we're going to end up asking. Did you make note of any COVID-19 disturbances in your daily reports for Hawkcount.org? This one's really important because the data is still important, but if they can tell, if anyone is using the data, if researchers are looking into this, they can look at the numbers, they can go back to particular days. If they have notes noted in their Hawkcount.org daily report and it's online, that really can help a researcher, if they're using this data, be able to say, oh, okay, well, that's not really a big deal for what we're looking at. So 90% said they did not make note. Now, should they have? That could be another question. But we also have another COVID survey that we've given out in the past that we can bring the two of those together. So this is just for this survey. Did your protocol and how you count change at all during the 2020-2021 COVID season? 66.3%, so 2/3 of our respondents said said no, it didn't really change. But we did have a third that said they did have to change their protocol in some way. This is the big one. In your opinion, should any of your data be flagged due to significant changes because of the pandemic? And this one is striking because 96% said no, you don't have to actually do anything with anything different with that data. But that also shows that that everyone's concerned. There might be little differences, but overall we should still be able to count their data as a season. And that's really important for longitudinal data when we're looking at trends. So most researchers in 10 years will have to remind themselves that there was a pandemic, and maybe they should look at some of the comments and not just the numbers. All right, so now we're going to start talking about the future of Hawk sites. Do you expect that your site will continue counting in 2022? The vast majority say yes. So 88% of our respondents said they expect to be running a Hawk count next season. But 8% said maybe, and the rest said no. And we know that's going to happen. We're always going to lose a few Hawk sites. The real question is, those that have been giving data for many years, are they going to end up stopping their count? Because that would be really difficult, if we are relying on their data over decades. We need to go a little bit deeper here. Now, this is perceived longevity of the Hawkwatch. We don't ever know how long a Hawkwatch is going to last. So the questions we're going to ask are, how confident are you that your site will be collecting data in 3 years, and then in 5 years, and then in 10 years? So the important piece here is that we have a scale that says it's doubtful that we'll be collecting data in 3 years. And this is going to say this is going to be very confident, like we're sure that we're going to be here in 3 years. Now what I did is I took the numerical values and I averaged them. And any of you that have worked with data understand averages can hide things. So again, we're going to look at the averages, and then we're going to come back and dive a little deeper into these. So how confident is your site that you'll be around in 3 years? 8. Actually, it's probably about an 8.2. That's why this circle right here is a little closer to the 9. It's probably about 8.15 on average. Now, as you might expect, uncertainty in the future is always going to be an issue. So how confident you'll be collecting in 5 years? Well, maybe that's like a 7.2, 7.3. So still pretty confident, or so it seems. How confident are you that your site will be collecting in 10 years? That's really far out, but in terms of hawk counting, if you look at data, that's not that far, but we drop down already to about a 5.5. So now let's not just use averages. Confidence in the future is what I'm titling this slide. And here on the right, I have a chart, percentage of sites that are very confident about counting in the future. So 88% of hawk sites said they are counting this upcoming season. And so what we're basically saying is when they said they were going to be very confident about their answer, that they'll be counting. 50% of hawk sites are very confident that they will be counting in 3 years. So when we ask them, how confident, how many can say they're going to be very confident they'll be counting in 3 years? 50%. And by year 5, that drops to 27%. So it's another way of thinking about this. And only 14% are very confident they will be collecting data in 10 years. So 15 of 98 respondents included a note about staffing the site as a major concern. So that's why we had at the end of the survey, they could make notes, and 15 out of our 98, so about 14, 15, 16%, somewhere around there. I'm sorry, probably 16%, said they are concerned about staffing. We'll get into that later. I guess we'll get into it now. How concerned are you about aging out of your current hawk counters at your Hawkwatch? And that's a pretty good concern. 10 would be very concerned. And remember, this is an average value. So on average, we're getting about a 6.9 here. How concerned are you about getting qualified hawk counters at your Hawkwatch? Well, it's definitely a concern. It's definitely not a concern. Sorry about the play on words there, but I think you get my point. So we're definitely, feeling the overall stress of or anxiety about our hawk watches. And how concerned are you about finding spotters and helpers at your Hawkwatch? And that's a 6. So, well, 5 might not be as high. 6, remember, down at this end of the scale is not a concern, and to the right is very concerned. So there's definitely anxiety there, as you would expect. All right, percentage that of respondents that marked very concerned. So they put a 10. And this is why averages can be deceiving. So how concerned are we? Well, 35%, if you look at this bar graph to the left, 35% of our respondents put a 10 as very concerned about aging out of our hawk counters. 35%, which means there's others that are younger and maybe they're the only counter and they're not concerned about that. But 35% are very concerned about the aging out. And a quarter of all of our respondents also marked a 10 as very concerned about getting qualified hawk counters. And then 20%, or a little bit less, probably about 19%, said they were very concerned about finding spotters and helpers. So that really gives context to when we say, well, it doesn't look that bad. It won't let me go back right now. I was going to go back to the other slide, but that's the difference between averages and looking at the individual values. So this particular slide should give us all pause that for many sites, this is a very, very big concern. All right, we'll switch gears a little bit and talk about financial and physical issues. So how concerned are you, and this was asked to all the respondents, how concerned are you about the financial support, from donations, grants at your Hawkwatch, and whatever support you have to stay current? Well, that was like a 3.7, something like that. If you look at I guess my arrow's not working here, but a 3.7 on that first question. So most sites are not as concerned about this as personnel. Second question, at your Hawkwatch, how concerned are you at changes in weather, wind, or climate, example, warming, that are affecting your Raptor counts? And there's definitely a concern. Now with that, we would have some sites that felt very concerned. Others that did not feel concerned at all. And so again, these are averages. And the last question says, at your Hawk site, how concerned are you about overgrowth of the original Hawk site? Overgrowth refers to the visibility in response to growing or regrowing of forest around a count site, which may hinder detection or possibly alter migration patterns locally. So I put a note to myself down here that while this 4 signifies that most sites are not as concerned with tree obstruction and visibility, 8 sites did mark 10 as very concerned. So you can see that all of our Hawk sites have localized issues that are very important to them. So we need to really understand that every Hawk site is unique and has their own set of problems. Has your Hawk site needed to be moved in the last decade? For some Hawk site owners, or if they've established a Hawk site, most of them didn't understand this question. They would think, well, if you're moving a Hawk site, you have to start a new Hawk site. Some have had to relocate on their own land or move 500 feet to one side or to another parking lot or whatever it might happen to be. So we certainly do have some Hawk sites that needed to be moved. And that also allows us to know if we should be looking at their data, or at least questioning their data a little bit. I'm the Eastern Flyway editor for Hawk Migration Studies, so I deal with this all the time. I notice a name has changed or something has changed, and I'll need to give them an email and try and find out if something's different, or if the data is the same, or if they've changed the name of the site, even though it's still the same site. These issues come up all the time. So, 8% said in the last decade they've had to move in some way. So that also lets us know that not all Hawk sites are as static as we like to think they are. And that's also important to note, especially if researchers are using this data. So is your Hawk site on private or public land? And we have a 70-30 split here. Most are on public land, 30% is on private land. And if you're on public land, you probably have some ideas that having it the other way would be better, but that's not what we're seeing in the comments. There's always stress about land, and we'll get to that later. There were questions on the survey about Raptor numbers and security, so I'll read them. At your Hawk site, how concerned are you about the decreased number of Raptors over the years? And we got a 6 on this particular, probably a 6.2 on this particular average for the survey. And some are very concerned and others are not as concerned. So again, that might be regional, that might be a particular site having a change in wind or whatever it might happen to be. So here's one. How concerned are you about losing access to your Hawk site? Overall, it's about a 3.4. Most are not as concerned about losing their Hawk site. But again, some are very concerned. So when you look at the averages, you get an overall, temperature, but that doesn't mean that some sites aren't really hot with this particular issue. How concerned are you about your volunteers not being able to help due to financial constraints at your Hawkwatch? Gas money for longer travel distances, increased of turnpike tolls, inflation, being on a fixed income, etc. This was a 3. This is now mid-March, and I have a feeling if we gave this survey right now with the war in Ukraine and gas prices about to skyrocket, I have a feeling this would jump significantly. So that's why we put the question in, but unfortunately, I would expect that 2.9, whatever that is right there, is no longer going to be holding true. I know even for me, it's suddenly a concern. So we also asked a bunch of safety questions, and it turns out overall, looking at our assessment compared to the other issues, safety is not a major issue overall for Hawkwatches. That does not mean it is not a big issue for some particular Hawkwatches. So how concerned are you about wind turbines causing increased mortality of migrants passing your site or otherwise interfering with the migration? Overall, this was not as big of a concern. Of course, this is going to be a concern for hawk sites that are right in the path of the wind machines. How concerned are you about construction and development around your hawk site, logging, shopping centers, electrical power towers, and so on? Again, not that high, about a 3.2, 3.3. How concerned are you about your personal liability, risk, health, safety of visitors, and so on, and though the need for insurance at a particular site? Overall, this is not a big concern for the respondents of this particular survey. However, there are some comments that some Hawkwatchers had felt strongly about that HMANA needs to really, consider helping educate Hawkwatches about these issues. So. And how concerned are you about safety issues at your hawk site? Pathway to your site, trees falling, being alone on a mountain, lack of a cell phone, accessibility for getting a signal. Overall, not very high, a 2.9. But for some, it's a big concern. After reading all the comments, here's what I can conclude, because there's a lot of them and it takes a lot of time. Every site has unique issues that are important to that particular site. Money is a big factor for a few sites, but not a big concern for most. Private and public lands both share common feelings about lacking agency. For instance, if you have national state agencies that are managing that land, they can simply shut you down for a policy reason. A new administrator feels different about citizen science, their concerns about safety, whatever it might happen to be. And on the other end, private landowners can simply sell their property at any time. So if you're on private land, well, remember that can be sold. They can move. They can pass on. Their children can then inherit the land. And so both sides must abide by the rules of whoever's owning the land, and it gets tricky. So there's always going to be a little bit of anxiety about that, a little bit of uncertainty. One of the questions that did not turn out appropriately, and that was my fault, I forgot to put the appropriate options. Having a supporting organization is potentially like a good stabilizing force for Hawkwatches, but not always, as we found out in the comments. Everything's great when there's general agreement, but it's bad when there's tension. And so every hawk site has the standard drama of just living in a society, and so we cannot use too broad of a brush to paint Hawkwatchers and Hawkwatches as being too similar. They really do have their own unique flavor and problems. All right, so next steps. The real question now is, how does HMANA offer support to these Hawkwatches and I try to stay in contact with sites, with their data, especially if I'm analyzing it. But regardless, it's good to let them know that we hear them, and their voice is not unique in that many other sites share similar problems or issues or constraints, and knowing that often helps. So these are some things that we'll be working on in the future, but it's really a first step to hopefully supporting hawk watching in general, in particular hawk watches that are submitting data to hawkcount.org. So thank you very much for your attention. My name is Brian Wargo, and you can always email me at my HMANA email. That's the easiest way to get me. So, all right, thank you very much.